Howdy. Welcome
What
back.
up?
Today is March 14th. Wait, today's Pi Day. I just realized. 14th, 314. Excellent. It's all coming together. I don't know what that means. Circular. What's circles? What's the theology of circles? Tell me.
Holy cow. You want to dive right into that? I could talk about that a long time.
Really?
Yeah.
All circles. I don't know who wrote this, but are you familiar with Me Without You, the band?
No.
I think you would really enjoy them.
Okay.
Aaron Weiss and his brother started this band in like the late 90s, and they're kind of like very poetic, but like progressive metal-ish. Sometimes they're folky. They're very eclectic in their sound. Like their earlier albums were very heavy, but the lyrics are so well written. And the cool thing about Aaron Weiss and his brother is that they were raised by their mother, who's Jewish, and their father, who's Muslim. So
Nice.
they're very Abrahamic in their understanding of everything, but they also like are Christian adjacent too. So like, a lot of the imagery they use is like Old Testament, and they have some like Islamic mysticism in there too. It's really cool. But there's one song called All Circles. I'll have to send it to you. But all circles presuppose they end where they begin, but only in their leaving can they ever come back round. All circles presuppose. And then it just keeps going. And that's the whole
Yeah.
song. The whole
Sounds
song just keeps
perfect.
looping and looping. So it's
No, that
really
sounds
cool.
great. It's kind of that's really how I've been talking a lot about this recently, but it's how one of my favorite models or images is the spiral, or I'm
Hmm.
really into spiral dynamics. You're probably familiar, I would assume, a little bit, maybe.
I've a lot of the stuff I have just heard you guys say in passing
Mm-hmm.
in your conversations, but I haven't gotten a lot of definitions for these things. So I think that's kind of the reason why I wanted to talk to you too, is like, what do you mean by all these terms that you guys, by you guys, for anybody who's listening? I mean, we have this friend group that we discussed in a group chat over Signal, and it's this group of random people from all over the country
Mm-hmm.
and who are nerds about theology and philosophy and whatever else. Talking a lot about AI these days.
Yeah, all
That's the big
sorts of
discussion.
things. Yeah, well, most of spiral dynamics isn't like a lot of things I talk about are my completely made up terms. Spiral
Mm.
dynamics is not one of those.
Oh yeah.
And it's a really easy thing to Google image search, and there's better ones or not. But I mean, essentially the spiral, there's colors that are associated with it, and there are individual. I would say you can look at it individually or you can look at it corporately and culturally because there's these kind of uh, it's like an evolution of consciousness or an evolution of being almost. And so they color coordinate it to kind of eliminate better or worse or hierarchy. It's just but a spiral, the reason I like spiral and it's tied to circles is that there is a circularity to it. So it's like the Me Without You song that you're talking about, or T.S. Eliot. The end of Little Gidding, this poem has this great thing of or there's anything, like you step into a river, you never step into the same river twice, or like you leave your home and come back and you find it's the same, but it's new. So there's all these ideas, or John Vervaeke will quote this Zen or idea of like, when you or it's essentially like you see the mountains and the rivers and then you leave and you come back and the mountains are now mountains and the rivers are rivers. It's like they're the same, but there's been a change. Or like before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. So it's kind of like there's a circularity to a lot of things. And but then there's also with a spiral, there's also difference. So like depending on your frame of reference and how you're looking at it, it can look like a circle, but really there's a movement to it. There's a progression to it. There's an evolution to it.
Like on a two-dimensional level, it's just a circle. But
Right.
then like you look at it from the other dimension, it's like, oh, it's actually moving in a direction. It's going somewhere. It's not staying
Right.
still. And
Right.
even when it comes
Around a
back,
mystical center,
and
which
even
I
when it
love.
comes back, it's not at the same place.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, like it is, but it's not. And what's
Hmm.
interesting is like I've had a lot of these things in my life where there's certain experiences that I've had in my life, in my story, in my history, and my perspective on it and how I looked at it at the time was a certain way. And then, you know, you give me 10, 15 years and I come back to that same situation and I've had some epiphany or some revelation or some shift, some um you could call it act of grace or uh metanoia or whatever. And then you come back and you look back at that exact same experience and you see it in a completely different light, in a completely different way. And it almost gets into the, I mean, there's a lot of ideas connected into that eternal recursion, but yet, um, you know, multi causality. You know, it's not necessarily just like this linear causality. You can have something happen where a change in perspective actually changes your history. I mean, you look at it completely differently. You know, so I love, yeah, circles, man. There's a lot there.
All right. Well, it is Pi Day. I mean, it's apt that we speak of
Yeah.
it, isn't it? Yeah, it's interesting the whole spiral thing too. Like coming back, you know what I think of too is like, you know, I'm a musician, so when I play a song or when I play a certain riff or something, it's not the first time I've ever played that riff. I've probably played it a bunch of times before, but each time I play it, it's solidifying itself even more into my muscle memory. And it's like,
Hmm.
so I'm coming back to that point of on the circle, but I'm in a different place on the spiral, like in another dimensional direction, if that even makes
Yeah.
sense. Like it's
No,
like,
for sure.
but same thing with like everything else in our life. We're always learning and changing. We're always coming back to moments that are very similar or, you know, almost fractal in a sense.
Yeah. And everything's somewhat related. There's a memory and there's a resonance to that, you know, there's a
Mm,
vibration or a harmony or something where you're coming back to it, but like the greater the resonance is, the more impactful they are. Like one of my, I think this is connected to this, but one of my favorite big thinkers out there, um, who, I mean, he's known, but I think people sleep on him. He's got most of like the greatest stuff in there. It's just, but is Rupert Sheldrake, and he has this theory, which is his own unique theory called morphic resonance, and the basic idea is that, let me see if I can come up with the definition of it, but it's essentially that um, there are these fields of uh, habit and memory that manifest, um, that through like kind of instinctually manifest patterns throughout space and time, but they're independent of space and time. So like within science, he's a scientist, he's a biologist primarily, but he also has his degree in philosophy of science. So he's one of those scientists that actually understands philosophy, which is nice. But along like mainstream modernist scientists kind of discredit him, but he's fantastic and getting increasingly more respect, I think. So this theory is kind of like, the simplest way to think about it is like, if we think about things scientifically, you know, we know how proteins form and we know how certain molecules can form, but we don't know how necessarily organs form, or like how a, you know, an embryo, like a giraffe becomes a giraffe, or a walrus becomes a walrus, or a human being becomes a human being. We can't really map out that mechanism. And Rupert Sheldrake's basic theory is that, well, there are patterns, there are fields that have instinct and memory in them, that in which these things participate, that like have these forms and resonances over time. And he has a lot of experiments illustrating it. But what it made me think of is crystals. I can't remember why I was thinking of this, but crystals and resonances, because like something that will happen, and I'm a chemist by training, this is my education, but he says the first time a new crystalline structure is formed, because we've invented different crystals, the first time that it forms, it actually really resists taking shape. It's really hard to get the crystal to form, but once it's formed, it becomes easier and easier and faster. And it's interesting because it happens independently of space and time. So like you maybe form a crystal the first time ever that it's ever been formed by some scientist in North America, and then all of a sudden like some scientist in Africa or Australia can form the same crystal like eat more easily. Or like he's done these experiments with rats in a maze, where they have to figure out this maze and and to get the cheese or whatever. And after it takes them a long time to figure out the rats. But then once a rat of the same species, like the same morphology, the same exact species, once these rats figure it out, other rats across the world that have no genetic connection to these rats will also figure out the maze more quickly. So it's kind of like, it's crazy. Or like have you ever heard about like the 1 minute mile? So like we thought for a while no one would ever run a mile, no human being would ever run a mile in like sub 4 minutes. But then all of a sudden a human being did it, and then all of a sudden a bunch of people started doing it. Like once that line
Wow.
was broke, a lot of people started doing it.
That kind of thinking about like the history of religion, did the Abrahamic tradition do something that caused the rest of the world to start moving in that direction? You know what I mean? You know what I mean?
Well, I think
Like
so. You
it
could think
kind
of
of
that the same way.
yeah,
Like
because
a
like
new religious crystal formed, and then all of a
yeah.
sudden, a bunch
Hmm,
started forming. No, I
that's
think
really
that,
interesting.
yeah, I think that's true for sure.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, and man, there's so much there that is just so much too much for our brains to even comprehend, but still it's fascinating. You go down the wormhole, down the spiral.
Right. Yeah. Rupert Sheldrake's one of those guys that like his ideas, I think, are when they're new to you, they can either appear wacky or weird. But man, but see, even that, the longer you sit with them, the more you're just like you start resonating with it, and you're like, holy cow.
Yep.
Like that really makes a lot of sense and helps me understand a lot of stuff.
Yeah, it kind of is the same way with even like I want to say like there's almost like consciousnesses, not in like the new age sense, but like there's ways of thinking and frameworks of thinking that you become conscious of, as you
Hmm.
study, as you branch out. And it's so evident, like when you talk to someone who's very dualistic, you know what I mean?
Hmm.
It's like, oh wow, you are a different plane of existence than I am. You know what I mean? Like you see
Yeah.
things so black and white, and I'm sorry, and I hate to be elitist about it, but there's just, it's like it gets frustrating because then you almost can't really even talk to them because they're speaking a different language and you're speaking a different language. You know what I mean?
No, totally.
Um,
Well, that's really applicable actually to even spiral dynamics because it's what you're talking about, and I forget the color coding, but I think you're talking about essentially, I think it's the orange consciousness, and I forget the names of them. Um, but there's a certain cultural consciousness that starts because one of the things about the spiral, and my buddy Dan, shout out to him, he was explaining this to me, is one of the ways you can understand spiral dynamics is this oscillation between um, kind of the individual and the collective. So you're either seeing things very, very individualistically or very collectively, and you go back and forth. And so, or very dualistically, maybe, and non-dually, and you kind of oscillate back and forth as this movement goes up the spiral. And I think there's a kind of, it's either green or orange. There's a mode of consciousness that you're talking about that I think sees, um, it wouldn't be the orange, it'd be like the pre one that sees things in a very black and white. Like what you're talking about is maybe an orange or something, and then there's like a yellow, which is very integrative. Well, that's what's cool about spiral dynamics is eventually you get to this point, I think, and it's not even an elitist thing because it's integrative. Is you get to a place of somewhat integrating all the previous, because that's one of the things about the spiral is like all the previous things are within the yellow, but you can see them all clearly in almost kind of a non-judgmental way because you've gone through this spiral enough to see just like, oh, when I was like 20, I was an idiot. When I
mm,
was 30, I was an idiot. When I was 40, I was an idiot. And you've just
yeah,
done that enough to just be like I've had that experience a bunch, you know? Like I was a Calvinist for a long
hmm,
time. And then
yeah,
I
me
went
too.
through like a pretty like Calvinism is like the God of Calvinism is just evil. And like I went through that phase. And then I've come back around to it in a way where it's almost like, I wouldn't necessarily say that I self-identify as a Calvinist. It depends what you mean by that. Um, I definitely don't in like this mechanistic, linear, causative way where things are very black and white. Like it's more like a George MacDonald Calvinist or something, I guess, like if you want to say that.
Karl
But I don't even,
Barteen.
Yeah, but I don't even know how you'd really like that's pretty amorphous and nebulous, you know.
Yeah. Well, this is what it
But
gets
you
down
come
to. It's
back,
like
you know.
it's like on the surface you have like Calvinism and then whatever else there is. But like even just that, it's so like I get tired of that whole discussion, the whole debate of Calvinism
Yeah,
versus Arminianism,
same,
because
same.
it's like it's on a way more it's closer to the surface level of the spiral. You know what I mean? Where
Yeah,
it's like
yeah.
as the deeper you go, it's like that debate doesn't even matter. Like
No.
it's like you're, and this is what I get frustrated with. It's like um what is the what is the level at which, you know, the early church fathers, you know, the early church and even the writers of the New Testament, even some of like the prophets and whatnot in the Old Testament, like what is the level, where were they on the spiral? Well, when we try to take the top of the spiral and try to understand it from understand the bottom of the spiral from the top of the spiral, when it just turns into black and white, you know, it turns
Yeah,
into either or, and
yeah.
it doesn't you can't actually even comprehend what is actually happening there. You
No,
know, and
I think that's no, that's a really good point. I think that's fundamentally true. It's my favorite Lewis quote. What you see and hear depends a lot upon where you're standing. It also depends upon the kind of person you are. There's like, or like Peugeot will talk a lot about being initiated in something. Like part of what you see and hear and what you know is necessarily connected to your embodiment, the time in which you live, the cultures in which you live, the nation in which you live, the language in which you speak, all of these different um, factors. I think of it as like a Russian doll or nested eggs, all these different communities and fields in which you participate. And you cannot, there is no, Paul Vanderklee likes this word, there is no monarchical vision or there is no objective view from nowhere where you can just like abstract yourself from that and just be like, well, what did first century people think about this? Or what did church fathers think about this? You can't do that. You can't ever know what they thought about that. That isn't such a thing because you'll make all these anachronisms or you'll impose your consciousness or the way that you see things on them. And it becomes again, that's what I mean. Like the judgment, at some
mhm.
point, the judgment goes away because like we see things differently than them and probably better in some ways and probably worse in some ways. But
Yeah,
in which ways do we see things better? In which ways do we see things worse? You know, I
yeah.
don't know. I don't know
That's
what I
the
don't know.
that's a difficult place of discernment, and ultimately, like, I think that's like ultimately the veil that we're not allowed to cross. You know, because then we would be God, and we would no longer need God. We try to usurp Him, and um, but like, what was I just? I was just thinking a thought. Like this conversation is just bringing so much out of my mind, and right now. So basically, oh, what was I saying is like, you know, when I say the words like, what did the early church fathers think? What did they believe?
Mhm.
Well, what ends up happening, and I'll admit this, when I go back and read them or look at what they said, I end up just cherry picking what I like anyway and
For
throwing away.
sure.
You know what I mean? So it's hard
For
to get
sure.
any level of discernment. It's hard to really discern what's actually true and actually what's actually true or actually error or actually just like half truths or, and then there's obviously issue of translation, like and translation and interpretation, you know, and
Yeah. Well, I think this gets this is like it's illustrative of the point of non-judgment though, is
mm,
because like even because I think you fall into that. It's really easy. Another way to say objectivism, the way I like to talk about, is this either orism. You know, do we see it correctly or do they see it correctly? And I think that leads to what I call the exclusivist religion of the right side of history. It's just like this line that I've crossed, you know, I see my past. It's like the circle. And it's just like I've moved past this, but then everybody behind me is wrong. Was that correct? No, of course it's not correct. And so like even discerning what is true, like to your point of saying that, and because you go back and you selectively do it, you know, you pick the things that you like and not the things you don't like, but how can you trust that? And so like even within yourself, I think it's healthy to get to a place of non-judgment where you're just like, and this is very like my friend Sherry will talk about this because of Douglas Harding. He talks about the as is world versus the as if world. Or Lewis talks about this in his space trilogy in a different way, but it's kind of like if somebody's in either or mode, Well, that's where they are. There's no point in even judging that. Like they can't wish to be somewhere they're not. So that's where they are. So you just got to leave it be. If you maybe aren't in either or mode, that's fine too. That's not where you are. And the spiral allows you to see that without judgment, because like if that's where they are, there's no, like my grandpa used to say, you can wish in one hand and shit in the other and see which fills first. Like
Yeah.
you can wish they see things the way that you do, but that's not going to make them see things the way you do.
Mm,
And you can't wish yourself to see things differently than you do. Like it just is. Don't live in this
yeah.
as if world,
Mm,
because that's not real.
yeah. You know what I've been thinking about a lot more lately is especially over the past few years is actual practice. You know what I mean? Not because so far so often we get stuck on like the abstract, um and even sometimes we even get stuck on the experiences, like, oh, I had this one experience and therefore my one experience was objective and that this is the way everybody else has to experience it too. And then
Yeah.
even that can happen, but like when I look at the teachings of Jesus, um what was he most concerned about? What we do, you know,
Mm,
how we live our lives. I was hungry and you fed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was homeless and you housed me, you know,
yeah.
and and I think what happens oftentimes is there are people who are either intellectual or even religious who they're happy with following the rituals and going through the motions, but then their actual practice in their life is unaffected by their beliefs. And I think that's where I'm starting to think and wonder if um and I think this isn't new. You know, the whole concept of faith is not merely just something you intellectually ascend to. um it's not even necessarily something you experience either, but it's something, but it is an experience. I'm not saying it isn't an experience, and I'm not saying it isn't intellectual or propositional, but it's not only those things, but but ultimately if it doesn't lead you to actual doing, then what's the point, you know? It's just floating up in the air. So I've been thinking about that, like, because I have friends who are, you know, not Christians, either non-believers or agnostic, or maybe they're
hmm
Christian adjacent. Like I have one friend who's like Catholic adjacent, maybe, and he loves the Catholic worker movement, and he quit his job and his career in finance to basically work with the poor.
hmm
And meanwhile, I see Christians who are cradle Christians living their whole life believing in the word of God and the church, and they're still working at their banks. They're still doing their thing, buying things, buying items that are made through sweatshop slavery,
hmm
and you know, a lot of their life is just not really changed. And it makes me pause and wonder, like, wait a minute, is it really about what we intellectually ascend to? Is it necessarily even about um our personal experiences within that, you know? Is it more about what we do, and is that the marker of you know, there's the whole debate about justification and what that means. And the way I understand it is like, you know, the book of James, which is the letter of James, which is often like ignored completely, um, is very clear that, you know, we're not justified by faith alone, right? We're justified by our works, and our um show me your faith and I'll show you my good deeds, you know. So there's some level of um practicality where truth isn't necessarily something that is believed, ascended to, or even experienced, but lived out, you know. And when it is lived out, it works and it changes things, you know.
Yeah.
I don't know if that
I
brings any
think that,
thoughts to mind.
no, I mean, it's, what I was thinking kind of as you're talking is um, one of the ways that I often like to think about faith is is this radical trust in things that I don't comprehend. Um, because even to your point of even like assessing fruit, one of the ways that you were talking about these things that we practice versus things that we maybe I think that we think or self-identify with or belief, you know? Like, what does it mean to believe? Does that mean just thinking certain thoughts or self-identifying with certain thoughts? You know, or your friend, the guy who's the agnostic who then has quit his, you know, his lucrative, financially successful job to help the poor. Well, even I think this goes to your point, though. I think even the point that we were making earlier about objectivism, even our assessment of that is selective. Because how are we selecting our assessment of who's doing good work and who isn't? And there's certain metrics that we may look at that make it really easy to judge people, but again, it's like people are where they are. And so, like, even the persons who maybe are working at their banks and buying things with sweatshop and looking like consumerists, yeah, and maybe they are there to certain degrees, but like there are aspects that's kind of, you know, God knows the heart. And Jesus, like Jesus, one of the things in the New Testament it talks about that he, you know, he saw into the hearts of men for whatever reason. He was holy. You know, he had taken the log out of his own eye. And so he was able to perceive his perception of reality was not polluted by delusion or illusion. So he was able to do that. I don't have a lot of trust that I'm capable of doing that. So I try to I at least I aspire to really stay in this place. And I'm not good at this. Like I'm kind of preaching here, but like I'm not good at this. I really try to stay in this place, or I've been trying to stay in this place of non-judgment because I'm a very judgmental person. Like I grew up, I was very formed in judgment. And I really struggle even with self-judgment quite a bit. And I'm trying to get to the place where I'm building a muscle memory, a spiritual muscle memory where to your point of like why do I see what I see? Why is this thing popping to me? And should I trust that? Or should I doubt my ability to judge and assess and discern all these things, even when it comes to myself? Because it's just because like love is one of those things that's tricky. What this makes me think of, and then I'll shut up and see what you think. But like one of my favorite films, and books, it's a film and it's a book about Christianity and faith is the book Silence. It's this book by Shusaku Endo, and it was made. Oh, what's his name? Famous director who made the movie. Um, he's known for doing all the gangster films. The New Yorker guy. The heck? Why am I blanking on his name right now? Italian sounding dude. He did
Oh, I think I
whatever.
know what you're talking about.
It'll come to mind
I know what
eventually.
you're talking about. I can't think of his name either.
He did that movie with Leonardo DiCaprio,
Yeah.
where there's f bombs like
Is
every
it
other word.
Al something?
Whatever, it doesn't matter.
I want to say Al
Um,
Capone, but I know that he was just a
no,
gangster.
no, it ain't that. Um, but it's I can see his face. But it's a really great film, and he actually wrote in the current release of the book. He wrote an introduction to it, and this artist Makoto Fujimura. Have you ever heard of this guy? He's a current day artist who I really love, who's really into to the book for a variety of reasons, and he's written companion books to it. Like I went deep down this world of this book and film. Like it's one of those things where I've read the book multiple times. I saw the film like 3 times in the theater. It's one of those things that just like really resonated deeply with me. And to the point of everything that I was saying is it plays a lot on doubt and faith and knowledge and what does it mean to believe? What does it mean to doubt? What does it mean to apostatize? Um, because it's this story of these Portuguese priests that go to Japan under this time of Christian persecution when they're trying to get rid of all the Christians, and there's this heavy push to find all the priests to eradicate them from Japan because then they just think like the faith will die. And so, but like the people that were doing it were very clever. And so one of the ways that they would have them do it, the priests apostatize, is they would have this, it's called a fumi, which would be like it's an icon essentially. And they would have an icon of Christ or Mary or something like that. And they would have either the Christians, the Japanese Christians or the priests, they would have them either step on it or like spit on it or something like that to show their relinquishment, their apostasy of the faith. And this book just it's like, I don't know, it's so good. It's like one of those things. There's a few things that, to me, at least from my perspective, that I tell people when I'm just like, if you want to understand how I really see Christianity and how it's formed me a lot, I'm like, Silence is a book, George MacDonald's Lilith, like watch Terrence Malick films. It's always these pieces of art where I'm just like, if you want to understand how I see Christianity, like those are probably the ways that will really form it in you. But it's brilliant because, and it all to circle all back, is just like the main character, the way that he understood fidelity to his faith and to God, um, was something he really had to wrestle with. And it's a very Peter Rollins idea. It's just like Peter Rollins wrote this book called The Fidelity of Betrayal. It's one of his books. And it plays on that. It's Abraham, man. Like, what do you think of that? For example, Abraham is one of these stories that I think is just endlessly fascinating. And I've had lots of debates with my friend Nate about this. Is like, I'll ask you this question. Do you think Abraham, what do you think of the morality of the story of Abraham? Let's just put it that way. Like, do you think Abraham, when he was called to sacrifice Isaac, do you think when he was going to do that act, just tell me your thoughts on that. What do you think he was thinking? What do you think that implies about the nature of God, of faithfulness, of goodness?
Well, that's a
I
great
mean, like,
question.
that story's a trip, man.
What makes it so difficult is that we look back in time, right? And we're like, oh, this was like a type of Christ, right? But if I looked at it
Mhm.
like, I don't know, quote unquote, I'm doing air quotes because it's not video, but quote unquote objectively, or even with a modern framework, like obviously that would
Mhm.
be ludicrous from modern times. But in ancient times, I often wonder if it's just the way he was interpreting the spirit was speaking to him, and the fact that God didn't have him sacrifice his son. God was probably like, "Oh, whoa, whoa! I never, I didn't tell you to do that,
Mm.
man." You know what I mean? Because you get weary whenever someone says, "Thus saith the Lord," you get pretty
Mhm.
weary of that, right? Um, or whenever someone says, "God told me this," I mean, you gotta be weary of that. And it is curious, I don't look at the Old Testament as like very black and white, and maybe as I may have used to, higher up on the spiral. Um, farther down on the spiral, um, you recognize that there is an interpretive lens
Mhm.
within the historical context, and maybe child sacrifice was something that was going on in Abraham's culture.
Mhm.
Maybe there were some. Well, obviously, clearly in Baalism or whatever
Mhm.
that is, they were sacrificing their children to appease Molech. So that is a thing. But then and that really affects how you view the cross today. If you interpret that as um, um, Abraham is a type of the father, and Isaac is the type of the son, like in the Trinity.
Mhm.
Um, well, the issue you have is that the spirit or the angel, whatever it was, the angel of the Lord, right? It wasn't said that it was an actual like angel, but may have been this very spirit itself. Well, if the very spirit itself says, don't kill your son, take this ram instead,
Mhm.
um, then are we supposed to interpret that the father and the son were not in agreement, with the spirit? So I don't know. There's a lot that goes into that, but yeah, I don't know. I think we have to understand it within its ancient text context, and
Yeah.
but then like that does have some implications on our atonement theory in the modern times when we think of what happened on the cross. um, I don't think it was the father killing the son, to get out his pent up rage or get his chunk of flesh.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I mean, if you think about it in terms of, this is why Abraham, that story is almost endlessly fascinating to me. And I have ways that I lean with that, but I think it's one of those things where there isn't the reason, it's like the seminal story of Judaism, like that and Moses, um, and coming out of Egypt, but Abraham clearly, and that it's Abraham is the foundational figure of the Abrahamic faiths. I mean, that's the story. Because really, like at its simplest level, and it's endlessly fascinating. And people have been talking about it forever. Like most of the major world religions, Abrahamic religions, and it's kind of because at the most simple level, I think what it is like the promise made to Abraham was through you and your seed will all the nations of the earth be blessed. Which that isn't just like some abstract thing. It's just like through your lineage, through your son, through your seed. And so, at its most basic level, what it is God commanding Abraham to destroy the symbol of his promise to Abraham. And it's easy, I think, like it seems like to me what your first take on it was like, well, Abraham was confused about what God said, essentially. Like or like he was wrong by it. And I think I understand that impulse because like you could have I think that impulse is to somewhat um remove it's to somehow save God from some seemingly immoral like terrible act because if you just say bluntly God God wanted Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. He commanded him to do it. And now, like, you could say, like, because I would almost say, like, there's no point to him commanding Abraham to sacrifice Isaac if Abraham was just like, well, this doesn't really count. And he's going to bail me out. Like, he doesn't really mean it. Well, then there's no point in doing it. It's like an empty gesture. It's like a get out of jail free card. I actually think this is how Christians think of the resurrection often when they're like I don't actually have to be afraid of death because I'm just going to be resurrected. So like death isn't really a thing. Like I'm just going to take this belief in God thing, like my commitment, my self-identity, these ideas, and then I get out of jail free. I get out of death free card. Well, I don't think that's what God was doing with Abraham. Because to me, that's not faith. That's anti-faith. But, the book of Hebrews, right, does say that Abraham, if you're a Christian and you take this as canon, Abraham believed that God could even raise him from the dead. Now, what's interesting about that, from my understanding of this, is like resurrection wasn't a resurrection then, especially to Abraham, wasn't like a thing like it is to us now, especially in like this post-Christian world. Even around like First Temple Judaism, all the different sects of Jewish thought had different beliefs regarding resurrection. So like it wasn't even a common thing then, especially with Abraham. So so essentially Abraham was being called to kill Isaac with no context, again, no resonance. There wasn't the idea of resurrection. That wasn't even around. No one thought of that. But yet Hebrews tells us like he thought that was possible. No matter what, he's just like, I am gonna kill him. I'm gonna kill God's promise to me in this thing because he told me to. And I don't understand it. I can't comprehend it. But I have such a radical faith that it's beyond my comprehension that I just trust God. Like I don't know. Like I will do this immoral thing even though I don't understand it. Like that's my take on it. And Nate, my buddy Nate, is just like, no, that makes God a moral monster. And I'm like, well, yeah, but I think it has to, otherwise the whole story loses its punch.
Now, I think if God let him go ahead and kill his son, um, then we could make a consistent argument and be like, oh yeah, God commanded to kill his son, and he did it, and
Yeah.
what God commanded, he did. That's the thing about like the commandments of God. What is God actually asking us to do? Understand that. That's a great question there.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
maybe, well, that's why I beg the question of like, well, are we really understanding that? Are we really understanding, or did Abraham have his own interpretive lens? That he was struggling to understand God, or was God testing him to see some level of commitment Um, but that point you bring up about the fact that the promise to Abraham is that through his seed he bless all nations. He has descendants as many as the stars of the sky or the sand of the sea. Um,
Hmm.
or the sand of the desert, probably to them, not the
Hmm.
ocean. But yeah, it wouldn't make sense why God would want him to kill his own, that the very means of that promise. But
Yeah.
I mean, looking at Jesus, um, Jesus knew he was going to die, but do you think Jesus? I mean, Jesus must have known he was going to come back. Obviously, there were certain things that were probably veiled while they're just within time and space
See,
experience.
see, I don't know. I wouldn't be inclined to say that. I would
No.
say, I would say Jesus had the faith of Abraham.
Really?
Yeah. I actually think that's really important.
That's what's always bothered me about limited atonement, because it's like, wait, if Jesus willingly went to the cross, but he was only, but um, isn't that kind of selfish of him to resurrect himself but not resurrect everybody? It's like, oh, I'm gonna be fine, but some of you are gonna be good, but most of you are not. That's the kind of stuff that kind of bothers me.
Well,
Or if
like even
God,
the
or even if he knew he was gonna fail.
yeah, I mean, even the resurrection stuff though is, I don't, I say that, so I'm Orthodox, and so I say the creed every liturgy that I go, and say the creed more often than that when I'm doing my prayers, and it is you know, that's in there. People talk about that, but the problem with it, and this goes to what the creed is. Like the creed is, I think, somewhat aspirational, but also it's mystical. Like, what does it
Mhm.
mean to believe in the resurrection of the dead? I don't really know. I've said before, and I think this is true. I said, I think Christians understand the second coming and resurrection about as well as first century Jews understood the incarnation or the first coming.
Mm.
And I think that's not well. I think we understand it well. But I think that's largely because we have this transactional relationship where it's a get out of death free card.
Mhm.
And I don't think that's what it is. I don't know what it is. Again, I think that undercuts faith. I think if you use mammon, your
Mhm.
belief in resurrection that way, I think it actually subverts what faith is. And so, yeah, I mean, people will talk about the physical resurrection, bodily physical resurrection. Thomas
Spiritual
stuck his
resurrection.
hand in. Thomas stuck his hand in his side.
Mhm.
He ate fish. I mean, I'm familiar with apologetics. I know those
Mhm.
stories, and I affirm those and I agree with them. But like, there's also weird things like on the road to Emmaus, they didn't
Emmaus,
recognize
yeah.
him. On
One of the
at the
one
in
of
the
the things I've
garden, they
heard,
didn't recognize him. He
one of the
disappeared from rooms. It's weird.
one of the things that could be why they didn't recognize him is like just the very fact that Thomas touched his wounds, right? What does
Yeah.
that mean? Jesus's resurrected body had his wounds too.
Hmm.
That means his bloodied face, he was probably beaten to a pulp beyond recognition. So when he
Yeah.
resurrected, he's like probably looked like a zombie, honestly. you know, so that's probably could be a reason. Or it was just they didn't recognize him because their eyes couldn't see something that's transfigured and resurrected. Their eyes weren't
Mm,
open. But it does say that he opened their eyes to understand the scriptures, and even more in a fractal sense to understand the word of God, to be able to even comprehend the word himself, you know?
well, right. That's a very John Bear kind
Oh
of
yeah.
point. He makes that point all the time where he says, because he has this recurring sermon, like if you he or teaching, where he will make this point over and over that um explicitly in the upper room when Jesus showed up with them, they didn't recognize him at all,
Mhm.
which is kind of crazy. Like there's just this guy there that they're all just like chilling with. And then all of a sudden, which I mean, it's all weird. Like this is where none of these stories really make sense. And
Yeah.
then all of a sudden he opens the scriptures to them, revealing everything about himself. And then he breaks bread And so so in the opening of the Bear makes this point. So
Mhm.
in the opening of the scriptures and in the breaking of the bread, then all of a sudden their eyes are open and they see him for who he is.
Mm,
So Bear's point is that in order to see the resurrected Christ and to understand him and to have faith is the exact same now as it was for the disciples. Because he says a lot of times people will think like, well, if I was the disciples, I would just, and I was there and I could just see this literal historical critical
mm,
stuff. And if I was there, then I would just, the atheist is just like, why doesn't God just write it on the sky? Because you couldn't see it. That's not how it
yeah.
works.
Mm,
That's not how faith
yeah.
works. You wouldn't
Mm.
believe it.
Because it
It's sacramental.
gets into the concept of being born again too, right? Which was kind of hijacked during the Jesus movement in the 70s.
Mm,
It was all about born again. You must be born again. Well, what does that actually mean? Jesus was talking to a religious elite, an authority, and he's basically telling him like, you need to start over. Your religion is killing you. You need to start
yeah.
over. You need to be born again of the
Yeah.
spirit. Throw away the original one, but like, you're so stuck. You're so stuck
Yes.
at the top of the spiral. You need to get down to the
Well,
the lower
that's you're
levels.
stuck. Yeah, back to that. You're stuck in a
Mhm.
circle. An idea that's been really powerful for me. So my my crew, some of my friends from this little corner have been going through Valentin Tomberg's Meditations on the Tarot. And it's such a good book. Like it's crazy. I mean, I read some of it and I watch all their videos, but one of the things that Tomberg talks about is that he talks about the closed circle of the serpent, which is almost like the Ouroboros, like the snake eating its tail. But it's this closed loop that has no life to it. It's just this eternal recursion that you're trapped in forever. But then he says what Christianity adds into it though is death and resurrection, because death, the seed going into the ground, is actually what frees the seed from its stagnant place. The seed goes into the ground and dies, and boom, it brings forth much fruit. So then the circle, all of a sudden the circle breaks, and then you have a spiral. So it circles and breaks, death and resurrection, being born again, and it and
Yeah.
that and that takes the circle into this ascension. And I think we often, or you could even think of that as like revelation.
Yeah,
All of a
yeah.
sudden you see something new and it changes your whole reality. Boom, you break out of the circle.
Like you're going around the circle over and over again, and
Yeah,
then a new pathway opens and it's going up or
yeah,
down rather. It's going down.
yeah.
Oh, well, there's now it's going down. Now I'm on another level of the circle. Hey,
Hmm.
here's my question of all of this. How does it not become Gnosticism? You know what I mean?
In what way?
I don't like Gnosticism is kind of like this. I mean, it's a lot of things, isn't it? But basically the idea that there's like this hidden knowledge,
Mm,
that which I feel like there are just intrinsically things that are quote unquote Gnostic about Christianity, Christian mysticism, spirituality. Like just the fact that we say like there's things that you can't comprehend unless you are born again, right?
hmm.
I mean, how is that kind of like Gnostic in a sense where it's like there's this hidden knowledge that you are not privy to unless you are born again, unless your eyes have been opened by the breaking of the bread, by the opening of the scriptures. Mm.
Well, maybe so I mean, Gnosticism itself is like a complex, uh, it's a complex thing. Like again, it's not a monolith, right? Like I think David Bentley Hart is actually writing, he's working on some things about Gnosticism that are going to be coming out, because there's a lot of positives about Gnosticism too. That's kind of interesting. So I don't know that I mean, like most things, I don't know that I know enough to think about it. But what I would say is that maybe one of the freedoms and how this isn't Gnosticism is what the spiral shows you though, is like there's this increasing, maybe here, let me say it this way. One of my favorite verses in the New Testament is it's the whole book of First Corinthians, but I love First Corinthians 8, where it's just like, knowledge puffs us up, but love edifies. If anyone thinks he knows, he does not yet know as he ought to know. But if he loves God, he is known by God. And so it's this knowing as you are known, which I would say is like proper knowing. Like that's how you should really know things, is knowing how you are known. And maybe this isn't Gnostic, because the kind of proper knowing that God is calling you for is knowing that you don't know. Like that is the proper calling, because that allows for the spiral, that allows for repentance, that allows for seeing, for error correction,
Mm.
that allows you to see, or to bring in Ian McGilchrist, that allows your right brain to actually be the master, because that's the thing that sees what your left brain doesn't see, but it's inarticulable. But if that's always the master, you are always open to growth, to progress, to repentance, to seeing what you do not yet currently see. And that's proper knowing. So it's not like Gnostic in the sense that it's either or. Now I've arrived, now I'm here, now
Yeah.
everybody else is a dummy.
Well, it's like
It,
with the spiral, you have if you're thinking about that way, and if you kind of envision yourself, that's how you envision yourself in your spiritual walk. You know that there's deeper levels, that you haven't
yeah,
been. You know that there's levels, and then you know that there's levels that we can't even access, like in this realm of existence, right? It's like
yeah,
different.
you'd have
So
no idea. It's so
mhm,
far beyond you, you wouldn't even, there's nothing in you to even begin to apprehend it.
yeah, and and so often we have this impulse to want to like pre-package faith, like systematic theology, right?
Yeah.
Pre-package it into this neat, understandable thing, and so that we can even sell it and proselytize it, and but like
Hmm.
it's, but it's always lacking, and there's always something. There's a level of depth that it just doesn't have,
Yeah,
and when
it's not that Abrahamic faith, man.
once you're trying to sell it, then it's like then you think you're God and you think you can gatekeep truth and understanding
Right.
and
And you try to control it and
mm,
you commodify it, and it becomes all
yeah.
the grossest parts of religion, control and selling it. Like those are the
Mhm.
grossest parts of religion. Abuse, that's where all that comes from.
Yeah. Well, now that we've kind of gone down the spiral hole instead of the rabbit hole, the spiral hole
Hmm.
on this
Hmm.
here Pi Day, um, I'd like to hear more of your story. But first,
Okay.
I was just gonna run upstairs and check on my daughters real quick, and I'll be right back.
Okay. You're back.
Everybody's fine.
Good.
So, Lucas, Lukery, how you doing?
Hmm.
How is where are you zooming in from?
Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Minneapolis, wow. But you're not originally from Minnesota.
I am not a native. I'm from an adjacent state. I was born and raised in the state of South Dakota, which, for everyone who is not from one of the Dakotas, they just think of it as the Dakotas, and then they're just like, which one? Doesn't matter to me. It's irrelevant. It's the one with Mount Rushmore.
Hmm.
So they both have Badlands.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
A- and it's so yeah, I grew up in western South Dakota. So if you are from especially South Dakota, the big distinction for South Dakotans is culturally it's much more between east and west versus north and south. So western South Dakota, where I grew up right north of the Badlands, the South Dakota Badlands, is kind of, well, I always tell people, like, if you've seen Dances with Wolves, where Kevin Costner's outpost is, that was probably filmed within, I don't know, like 30 miles of my house. Um, that's basically what it looked like where I grew up. And the culture of Western South Dakota is much more like Wyoming or Montana or something like that than it is like Minnesota. So Eastern South Dakota is a lot more like Minnesota.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I mean, a lot of it's very rural, right?
Yeah, for sure. Like I just went back for my 20th year high school reunion, and I hadn't been to my hometown in like 15 years because my parents don't live there
Wow.
anymore. And and it was shocking, man. It was like culture shock. It was weird. It was very strange. Because even Rapid City, like the biggest city in the western side of the state, near where in the Black Hills, near Mount Rushmore, like I flew into there and I was just like, man, there's like nothing here. Even like in the town, the big city over there. I'm just like,
Mhm.
it's so stark and desolate. And it's like tumbleweeds rolling across, sometimes literally. It's weird.
Yeah, that's what's so fascinating about America is it's so diverse that like to try to get one idea of what it means to be American or even like and it makes sense why there's so much divide in politics because like you have just different things work for different places, and it's
For
really
sure.
fascinating.
For sure. And
Must be
where
a
you
lot of
grow
guns
up.
out there.
Yes. Yeah, for sure.
Mhm.
I mean, America in general has a lot of guns. I don't know what the ratio is. I've heard before. You just talked to Claiborne. He probably knows how many guns there are to every person.
Yeah, I want to say it was like something like 100 guns for every person or something
Yeah.
like that. I don't know. Well,
Yeah.
there's 360 million people in America. How many guns do you think there are? 500
I
million?
don't, a lot.
Maybe, I don't know.
So yeah, to your point though, I would say Western South Dakota bumps the average up, I think.
I'm
They're on the
sure.
high end of that average.
What are they waiting for? Canada to invade?
I don't know. I think part of it is so like my dad, for example, I've said this before, like I don't know how many guns he has. I don't know that he knows. Um, I mean hundreds for sure.
He has
I don't
hundreds of guns?
yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
I don't know. I don't know if I don't know. I don't know if it's closer to 1,000 or I don't know. I don't know. I have no idea. And he's my relationship with my dad is good. It's always strange. I always when I'm talking about my dad, I always say that the way that I describe him to people is growing up, he always used to say to me, "Who sired you, boy?" Or because I was just a weirdo kind of in my family. But
Who's
yeah, he's
harder
got
you?
who sired you?
Who
Who
sired you?
sired you, boy? Yeah.
What does that
Like
mean?
he's a cattle rancher. So like who's your sire? Who's your father?
Oh, okay. All
Um
right.
I mean he was saying it lovingly. My dad and I have a
Of
good
course.
relationship, but it's kind of just like where do you come from? You know?
Mm, yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of guns. There's a lot of what are they waiting for? I don't know. Like my dad, for example, I mean, he's kind of a collector. For him, it's kind of investment. Because I mean, guns don't ever really lose value. Like especially if you have certain older guns. They just I mean, if you think broadly of investments, like I don't know, I don't even know what's comparable. Land, maybe, maybe. So that's part of
Yeah,
it.
probably
He
land.
likes them a lot. Hunting is part of it.
Mhm.
I mean, he definitely has them for self-defense. He's his like pickup and like even his house and everything. There's basically like, which is funny to me. I give him shit sometimes. It's funny to me because he has all these things up of like, I don't know, different jokey things, but not really jokes of like, uh, careful breaking into this house type of a thing. Um, and I'm like, why do you put those up? Because I mean, I kind of feel like this is your Freudian unconscious fantasy that somebody would break into the house. You could just start just like blowing shit up. So I don't know why you're
You
warning them
know,
off.
that's kind of that's kind of what I recognize too. I think what scares me is not the people who just want to own guns for sports or hunting, or even people who are like very, what is it, soberly approach it with the idea of like self-defense. But then there are
Yeah.
some people that are like they're waiting, like they're waiting for like I'm sure during when COVID hit, like all the doomsday prepper was like, I'm ready. This is what I've been
Hmm.
waiting for. And
Yeah.
then the fact that it didn't turn out like an apocalyptic thing in the pop sense of
Yeah.
apocalypse, um,
Yeah. I
probably
mean,
was let
time will
down.
tell. So yeah, so that's my dad. I grew up in West South Dakota. That's kind of my general thing. I mean, it's put me. So what's interesting about me, and then so my wife and I moved to Minneapolis. We've lived here for a long time. We've moved kind of all around. We tend to go in circles of people. You know me from the Signal. I like to talk about philosophy and books and theology and all sorts of things. My wife, we both went to 4-year schools and did some post-secondary schooling and things. I mean, my wife did, I didn't. And I so we're kind of a weird mix. We often say it's hard for us to find people to relate to because we have very like blue collar to less than blue collar roots.
Yeah.
I often say I'm half hillbilly, half redneck in my upbringing. And now we traffic in, upper middle class, highly educated circles. And so it's kind of like we feel a little out of place. We feel both in place and out of place in both worlds. So it's a weird mix.
It's fascinating. So what kind of Christian tradition did you grow up in?
Um, I always say evangelical mutt, because it's kind of the church I went to growing up, where my family was when I was really young, I mean, technically it was an E-free church. But it's very small town, South Dakota. So like my hometown had, I don't know, when growing up, it probably had 1,200 people. Now it's probably has less than that. Um, I mean, I don't even know what it has now, 800 maybe. It's shrinking. So it's a very, very small town. And like nothing even around it. So like how much does the evangelical free ethos get transmitted there? I don't know. So I mean, very just standard. It felt like a very standard non-denominational kind of Bible-y church. So I didn't even know. So growing up to all that, like I didn't know what any of this stuff meant, or I didn't have any theological words. Very trained in Bible stuff and Bible memory. That was big for my mom. We did like Awana and all that kind of stuff. So I knew a lot of Bible stories. There was always um illustrated picture Bibles around. And but so like I grew up with a lot of Bible. I was homeschooled a few years on and off, went to some Christian schools on and off, so very Bible-y. But then I don't know, and this is kind of what's crazy about evangelicalism. It's kind of like a traditionless tradition. It's this weird thing. And so then later on in high school, we went to like this Methodist church in a closer town for I don't know why, or a different town. And then in college, I went to just various Baptist churches, kind of, but it all just kind of felt the same, you know. And then until coming out to Minneapolis, we started looking for a church and went all over the place. And so what happened to me was we came out here and we were looking for a church. And I was reading these two books at the same time because I was deciding to come out here. I was going to start getting serious about my faith again. I'd felt kind of like a hypocrite throughout high school and college. And I was reading two books simultaneously, and I didn't even know that this was weird. So I was reading Greg Boyd's book, Letters from a Skeptic, that he wrote to his father, which is a great book. And I was reading John MacArthur's book, Hard to Believe. And I was reading them like in parallel. And I didn't even know that was weird because I didn't know what open theism was. I didn't know what Calvinism was. I didn't know anything. Like I'd heard of MacArthur, obviously. I knew, I had a MacArthur study Bible where and I know that the notes, the notes about all the verses have as much authority as the text itself. I knew that. Um, and that's when I started going to all these churches. I went to Greg Boyd's church. I had a meeting with him actually where I wanted to talk to him about his book, which that was funny. That was an interesting experience
Wait, did
because
you
I just
actually
didn't
talk
know
with
it.
him?
Yeah.
You did?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
So
super cool.
I didn't even know. I had no idea what I didn't know at the time.
Yeah, I
I
hear you.
hadn't fallen off the peak of Mount Stupid yet. And so
Mhm.
I remember talking to him about his book, and I remember him asking me the question because I was just chatting with him about throwing around all these words. I didn't know what they meant, Calvinism, open theism, because I was learning all this stuff at the time. And he was like, and I think I was kind of just a naturally born Calvinist. And I remember talking to him, and I was like, so that's the right one, I think. And I said, and I knew I liked Greg Boyd. I liked his book. I liked everything. And so I was kind of like, so he's like, so which one of those do you think I am? because I was talking to him and he's like, I don't know, Calvinist. He's like, you didn't read my book, did you? And I was like, no, I did. But I just didn't, I don't know. I just didn't know how to talk about any of that stuff yet.
You weren't at
Um,
that level of the spiral yet.
yeah, I guess. Yeah. And so then we ended up at Bethlehem Baptist Church, which is John Piper's church. Because my mom had heard of him, which it's all, I don't know, it's all interesting because at that point my mom wasn't a Calvinist. Because what happened is I went to Piper's church when he was preaching through Romans. I became a Calvinist and a very like adamant fundamentalist Calvinist because I'm just zealous by nature. Started reading like Wayne Grudem's Systematic Theology. Started reading Jonathan Edwards, was taking this class on Jonathan Edwards, The Freedom of the Will. Just like diving in deep. And then my mom wasn't a Calvinist at the time. She had recommended Piper to me. And I remember I started talking to her about Calvinism and she was very adamantly opposed. And now she's a Calvinist that goes to like some Southern Baptist church and now thinks I'm a heretic because I'm not a Calvinist anymore. It's funny how all this works, you know?
Well, what happens is I remember, I grew up similar to you, non-denominational, but with the charismatic flair to it. So it was very much about the movement of the Spirit, experiencing God in worship and whatnot. So I didn't even know about Calvinism or Arminianism or anything like that. But I remember from a young age, like coming across on YouTube, Jonathan Piper and thinking like, oh, he's really cool. The another one that I really love is, and I still like this guy. This guy that I really like is Alistair Begg. He's like a reformed pastor, but just the way the way he speaks about
he's Scottish.
God, he's Scottish. Maybe it's just because he's Scottish. No, but he always makes like, he kind of, you know how in Anglicanism, there's kind of this erudite style, where
Anglicanism definitely has a different flavor.
Where they speak with like a higher, like he speaks, like uses references from culture, not just pop cultures, but like culture, and especially for him, like the 60s and 70s were really formational for him. So he references a lot of like 60s artists and stuff like that. So I don't know, it just really, the way he spoke about it, it wasn't until later on that I realized that all these guys are Calvinists. I'm like, wow.
Oh, for sure. It's funny. How did you, I'm looking for a blanket because I'm cold. How did you come across Alistair Begg then?
We had a local radio station on AM, like an AM radio station. And I used to I was just when I first had my first car, I used to just scroll through the AM station. And there was this one station that they'd always have preaching on. And I, as a good Christian, I liked listening to preachers. I thought it was really interesting hearing what they had to say. And so on my way to college, I'd be listening to Alistair Begg, and every morning, because he was always between 7:30 and 8, he had a sermon on in his song. It was such a catchy song, and I'd be eating my Cumbies
intro jingle.
Yeah, I'd be eating my Cumberland Farms sandwich and coffee. You guys don't have Cumberland Farms out there.
I feel like I've heard of it, but no.
If you come out to the New England, there's this company out of Rhode Island called Cumberland Farms, and it's like one of those gas stations that just has like just really great selection of food it's frozen food that they just heat up in a convection oven. But it's really
it's not like a mass distributed thing at grocery stores. It's like a gas station brand.
It's a gas station and a convenience store, but it's one of my favorite places. Plus they have an app that if you use the app, you get 10 cents off of gas. So it's pretty awesome. Yeah.
Nice.
But I used to get my Cumbies on my way to school and listen to Alistair Begg, and I always enjoyed his preaching,
Yeah, it's so funny. I don't listen to sermons at all anymore, but I used to a lot, man. Hundreds of those suckers.
Yeah. Like 4 or 5 years ago, I similarly, especially when I got married and moved away, we kind of were on and off with visiting church, and we didn't actually officially become members to that church that we were visiting at the time. And and I actually kind of had my own personal spiritual revival, and I was listening to Alistair Begg basically just preach through the book of Ephesians. It still is one of my favorite letters of Paul, especially Ephesians 1 is just so deep and rich, so much rich theology and so much emphasis on the love of God, like that you would grasp the love of God, that would really
Yeah.
take root in you, that just the pastoral heart of Paul, the way
Yeah.
he spoke, and also the eschatological vision of like there you have in Ephesians 1's that whole recapitulation of everything, which of course when he got to that point, and I remember this is way before I even knew what universalism was, but I remember him
Mm.
saying, and there's a lot of people who consider themselves universalists who think this is talking about the restoration of all people and all things. Well, that's not the case, basically trying to
Let me just
downplay.
tell you before you even start thinking about it, that ain't right.
Okay, so when it says that God's going to recapitulate everything and restore everything, that's not what he really means. It's like, what I mean? Kind of
Yeah.
gaslighting me before I could even get on that train. But during that time, I had this like revival of faith in myself, and but I grew up like, if I were to categorize myself, very Armenian. Like I believe that God died for all people, that everybody had the chance, but it was also like the downside of Arminianism is like it's all about you and your response, right? And
Yeah.
that kind of makes it even scarier in some ways, because then you can like lose your faith, and if you can backslide, it's all about backsliding, right? Oh, he's backsliding. It's just funny when I think about these terms that would always get tossed around.
So backslidden was a term that got thrown around in Arminianism a lot. I mean, Calvinists would
Well,
talk about backsliding.
no, I mean, I think
too,
just
but
in Christianity in general, but
yeah.
I'd hear it all a lot, like because your faith was up in the air, you don't know. I mean, your salvation rather is up in the air, you don't know. Like and ironically, in Calvinism, your faith is also up in the air because you don't know if you're one of the elect. You don't know if you're going to persevere to the end. That keeps people up at night.
Well, and I would say it's kind of, there's all these different ways of thinking about it. Because as you were talking, I mean, and like if I talk to somebody like Jason, for example, and I tell him I love it. Like I love that he's such a like Jason's the Bible thumper of all Bible
I love
thumpers.
it. Yeah.
That dude is just like Bible all day.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that aspect of a lot of different. I love that's one of the gifts that I think that I'm very grateful for of my time in the whatever Reformed Baptist Calvinist tradition is they are so that every blessing is a curse. One of the blessings of this radical biblicism is they focus a lot on the Bible and they go through the Bible a lot, and it's not like and that has gifts that come along with it. It's not like the Orthodox or the Catholic don't have the Bible. They just have or like churches that use a lectionary, they have the Bible and they go through the Bible in a way that is also helpful. It's just different. It isn't like this deep dive. I remember that with MacArthur. Like that's one of the things that I learned from MacArthur, and it was really good for me. And one of the reasons I love First Corinthians is I used the MacArthur Bible study method on the book of First Corinthians. So like from Piper, I learned biblical diagramming and biblical note taking. And so I would go through with all these different colored pens and diagram and graph in this way that I learned all the different connections and verbs and phrases and what is connected to what and arrows and all these. So like I have I don't know where it is somewhere, but I have like my old ESV handy size Bible that if I flip through First Corinthians, it's just like a rainbow all over the place of just all these different things. And I just read because the MacArthur study method is you take a book of the Bible and you read it like over and over every day for like a month. And like you'll read the whole thing every day. And then you go through it slowly every day in different ways. So you just like immerse yourself in this text. And like that's awesome. That's a really cool thing.
It is cool,
It's
and it's kind of like almost sacramental in a way, right? Because it's like you're immersing yourself in it. You're reading it so that it gets infused into you. And there's something which is kind of ironically, it's I don't know, that kind of divide between propositional versus like more experiential or sacramental. Because sacramentalism isn't really, it can be intellectual, but I feel like mostly just like experiencing and doing, right? And it's not that like just reading the Bible does something for you, but they believe, as many Christians do, that when you read the Bible, it's not just like reading anything else. You're reading something holy that's like infused with some sort of authority and inspiration.
For sure. There's a lot of piety. Yes. Yeah, it's great. And I mean, do I think then that they'll like, because we all participate in the same, like I was saying much earlier, everything that you know is embedded in, your family, your culture, your traditions, all of that. So do I think even though they have that practice and that discipline of Bible reading, I think then they go and impose because of this other cultural influence. This is what I've always said. A lot of people who are so focused on exegesis end up doing a whole lot of eisegesis.
Oh,
They're like
true.
reading all sorts of stuff into the text. I'm just like, That's not there." Like you think that's there, but I don't think
Mm,
that's there. It's kind of what you were saying earlier, that you pick and choose the things that you like from what the church fathers said. You do that with the Bible too.
it's true. Yeah.
You'll
Mhm.
explain this away in light of this. Well, that's what
You have to
Jason
try.
always makes that point, and I think it's brilliant. Like you don't believe the Bible hard enough.
You don't believe it hard enough. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Well, that's like, I don't know if you're familiar with like Peter Hyatt. Um,
Yeah.
he was
Yeah.
he was pretty cool. When I discovered his stuff, that was during this time where I found myself moving in this direction of believing universal salvation. And Peter
Mm-hmm.
Hyatt's he grew up Calvinist, but like the way he understands it is rather Bardian
Mm-hmm.
understanding. And Bart never like came out and said, I believe everyone will be saved, but just like the logical conclusions you can make from his theology is that like, how can not everybody be saved? But with Peter Hyatt, what was I gonna say? Oh, what got him in trouble in his Presbyterian church where he was pastoring was reading the Bible, the Bible passages that the other ones ignore, other people ignore,
Mm-hmm.
like, behold, I make all things new, and then as he reads that, um, um, he didn't like qualify it by saying, well, we know that he's not making all things new, or the passages that are like the all passages about,
Mm-hmm.
um, that in Christ all things will be reconciled. Like Colossians 1 is a great example.
Yeah.
He's the creator of all things. He's also the reconciler of all things. And because he wouldn't qualify it and he's just reading the scripture as it is, they got upset with him and they even put him on like a church trial. So
Mm-hmm.
it's that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Those church trials are always rough. That's I mean, I haven't I haven't quite experienced the full up church trial, but I've experienced church. I don't even know if you'd call it church discipline. I don't know what it was. It wasn't fun. I know that. But I mean um that's kind of back to my story a little bit. If we want to jump back there. So like I'll try to be quick. So like speaking of universalism and all these things, so we left John Piper's church because we had to move, and I ended up in this church called Sovereign Grace Ministries, and that's probably where I spent a big chunk of my time when our first stint in Minneapolis, they're like Reformed Charismatic. So it's interesting. They call it continuationist now. So it's a bunch of these people that pretty much grew up in like Assemblies of God, but then became to like Reformed Calvinist soteriology. So like doctrines of grace
That's
in
fascinating.
relation to atonement. So then they're like these Reformed Charismatics. So they're, an interesting bunch.
Mm,
Which is actually like what Driscoll was. John Piper's that too. Like all these kind of gospel coalition guys are kind of
yeah.
that. Um, and
Gospel Coalition is like the sugary pill with the hard pill inside, like
yeah, it's
yeah.
good. It's good. Helps it go down. Helps the
Helps it go
medicine go
down. It's
down.
the pudding. It's the spoon of pudding with the hard pill. Yeah, that's what it
Hmm.
is.
Yeah, you're a piece of shit covered with the sweet, sweet pudding of Christ's grace. Um, so
Essentially, yeah.
so then we moved, and during one of these moves, I got exposed to other people and other things a little bit. I always read books that people didn't want me to read. I read all the Piper books. I read a lot of those prescribed books that everybody liked in those circles, but then I was also reading things like Blue Like Jazz, Rob Bell, Peter Rollins. I read, who were some of the other emergent cats?
That's
I
hilarious. I
read,
was I was looking at I have a copy of Blue Like Jazz that my brother was reading almost
it's
20 years ago.
fantastic.
20 years ago. Well, I read it recently, and I'm like, you know what, this guy's a little too angsty. Like, you gotta get over himself. But at the same time, I kind of understand in the historical context, like with the whole Bush War
Right.
and there was the emerging debate of like homosexuality, like how do we deal with that in the
Hmm.
public sector, you know. It's crazy how recent all of that is, just as a side
Oh
note.
yeah.
But
I mean, it's not that much. Like for people my age that kind of went through it, like it
mm,
seems it's both recent and kind of old. But yeah, that whole Paul Vanderklay will talk about that too a lot. The emergent movement, because
mm,
people love to talk about Driscoll because of that podcast that came out, and because he was kind of like, what was he? He was part of the, I always forget this, part of the emerging, but not the emergent movement.
wait, Driscoll
Emerging and
was
emergent was
emerging?
different. Yeah.
Really? I thought he was just a reformed, like probably self. I always figured he was like probably self ordained or something like that. I don't know. Like,
Well, because part of it was, I mean, that split was kind of along political conservative liberal lines, really. So, like someone who, because I mean, this is the thing. I don't even know what these guys are. Because Rob Bell was like one of the classic emerging guys. Because like it was
Eugene
just this,
Peterson,
yeah. I mean, it was
Eugene
just this
Peterson, the Mission
new,
Bible.
yeah, it was just this new movement of kind of I mean, I don't even know what you'd call the major characteristics of it. Kind of like,
Well, I
um,
think on the good end, there was kind of this aspect, there was this focus on social justice that was arising, like trying to think more in those terms. And you had all this leading up to, you know, Obama running for president. So like at the time, like my brothers were really influenced by a lot of those emerging theologians like Brian McLaren, Eugene
yeah, Brian
Peterson,
McLaren. Read some
even
Brian McLaren
Bono.
books. Yep.
Bono,
Well,
you know.
that Bono interview with Eugene Peterson, which was
Yeah.
really good.
My
Um,
actually my friend, shout out to Johnny Rogers, aka Cinder Talk. My friend made the background music. He composed the background music for that
oh,
interview.
that's sweet.
Yeah, it's really cool. He lives out in Oregon. I'll have to tell him
Yeah,
that I
that's
mentioned
sweet.
him.
Yeah, that was a great interview. So like
I actually haven't
I
listened.
mean,
I need to check it out.
I was taking in all this stuff, like I was reading Brian McLaren and Rob Bell and whatever. And I think sometimes these people are hard to pin actually on in the culture war narrative between conservative and liberal because I mean, a lot of people, for example, let's just pick like a couple good examples, like Tim Keller and Rob Bell, for example. Like Tim Keller is a reformed Presbyterian pastor in New York who, like, he's written a lot on social justice. He has a book called Generous Justice, which is a really great book on essentially social justice. And he goes through all these dynamics. And it's funny, like even now, some people, I don't know, people that are politically inclined just are obnoxious to me in general because I don't like politics, but I'm an anarchist, so I wouldn't I love so to quote to quote another reform guy, but Doug Wilson, he riffing on Marx, he says politics are the opiate of the masses. And I'm just like, love me some Doug Wilson quote.
I hate love Doug Wilson. You know, I love
Yeah,
hate
me
him.
too. Me
He
too.
can be
I mean,
so annoying, but
but he's hilarious. He's one of the funniest writers I've ever read. Like I always bring this up, but he has this line describing David Bentley Hart, which is my favorite description of David Bentley Hart, where he says, David Bentley Hart is in my rough estimate about 3 times smarter than me. The problem is that he writes as if he were 5 times smarter, and I find it off-putting. And I'm just like, that's such a funny way
yes,
of describing him.
David Bentley Hart is down. He's gone down the spiral, and he no longer the more if you listen to his more recent interviews, he's lost all of his patience. He has no more patience for people who refuse to move down the spiral and get on
Well,
his level to some degree.
and this is what I mean. He's never going to listen to this, but
Yeah,
my impression of David Bentley Hart, and I love a lot of his ideas, but like he is, and he hates it when people say this, but he is still very Protestant in this regard, in my opinion, in
for
that he's a
sure.
culture warrior.
Mhm.
He
I
doesn't
don't know.
like people that are outside of the enlightened camp. He
I don't
gets
know if he's a
really mad.
culture warrior. I think he actually leans more of like a socialist like democratic socialist progressive way
I know, but that's what I mean.
politically.
But people that aren't that, he thinks are dummies.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of get it. because I think I probably lean more in that progressive camp as well, like politically, but I'm also very conservative in a lot of ways. So it's like, I don't know. I'm a political mutt, I guess you could say, in that
Yeah.
sense. But
So,
yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
I don't know what I was saying. Anyway, your story. So
Yeah.
how did you end up getting to orthodoxy? Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
So yeah. So anyhow, we were Minneapolis, at Bethlehem, at Sovereign Grace, went to a bunch of other churches. I was always reading other stuff. And then the next major move, I think, is I was living in Washington for a while, Washington State, and I came across this YouTube video between it was a debate, it was apologetics. I was into a lot of apologetics, listened to a lot of Greg Kokel, Stand to Reason, who drives me nuts now. Um, and and it was this debate between I forget the guy. He was like a Hispanic dude. I forget his name. Something Rodriguez and Chris Date. And it was on annihilationism versus eternal conscious torment. And it's the first time I'd ever seen Chris Date, but I was so schooled in like biblicist kind of exegesis. The Bible is our authority. Like, what does the Bible teach? That like that's the real power of Chris Date, man. If you really listen to Chris Date and you really believe in like sola scriptura, uh you gonna become an annihilationist. I would say like it's kind of inevitable because like if you take that approach, um I think that's just where you end up. And so I remember listening to that debate, and it was like a 2 hour debate or something, and I came away from it just being like, okay, like Date kind of demolished this guy biblically, like just made him look like a fool, and he kind of only had just like really weak philosophy to respond with that wasn't even good. But I was just like, but that's not the right position. So I was like, what? And it was
He
one of those
broke
like
your
kind of
he broke your
it was a
circle,
death. It was a death, right?
broke your
And it was
circle and forced you down the spiral.
right. It was a liminal moment, and so that sent me down this path where went like deep into annihilationism and rethinking hell and listening to a lot of that podcast. And at some point on there, I became friends with Preston Sprinkle, and so I was like interacting with all of these ideas and annihilation and then at some point I moved to South Dakota. We moved to South. This was one of the other moves. And I remember I was going to go to a church plant, which was a Sovereign Grace church plant, because that's what I had known before. And I was still in that world, but I got together with the pastor beforehand and wanted to tell him kind of, like, uh, I know this isn't the general thought of conception of hell, but this is where I'm at. And I just want to be upfront about that and tell you that's where I am. And I would love to be able to process this in community because I don't think we should be like reading the Bible in isolation. And I just prefaced all that, and needless to say, like we were there a couple years and like it didn't go well. It's like my worst church experience I've ever had. um the short version of what happened is I was getting together with this guy for coffees, and we would talk about a variety of things, and we'd often get into it and kind of conflict a little bit. I think part of it was he's just more naturally temperamentally conservative and I'm not. And it wasn't even political. It's just kind of like I'm very open to ideas and I'm not really afraid of new ideas, kind of in the Jonathan Haidt way of being liberal. Like I'm very open to new ideas and experiences, and they don't scare me. And he just isn't really. And so then I was like, well, Matthew 18, like how should we approach this? We're having trouble talking. So like let's bring in a third party and talk about it. And so then I invited the associate pastor to have a just like talk with us together at my house. And then I go to open the door when the associate pastor shows up, and it's not just him, it's him and the head pastor. And like I could just tell like instantly, oh, like this isn't what I thought it was. Like this is like an intervention. This is like a thing. And it just felt really gross, I guess is the easiest way to say it, the whole time. And I basically got in this group with them. We were all sitting there. My wife is downstairs with our kids. And basically the guy that I've been meeting with all the time, like he basically just in that conversation came out and said, like we're not really friends. Like I was just basically getting together with you all the time to take up your bandwidth so that you wouldn't like spread your heresy to other people. Like that's more or less what he told me. Um,
Wow,
and I
that's rough.
and I was and I was just really, I don't know, like
That's like
it's like
how
getting
t-
slapped in the face. Like I was very
how to get
dumbstruck.
someone to leave your church 101.
And so that was really, I don't know, felt really betrayed and lied to, because I mean, I think that's what it is. I'd like again, like I think he was well intended. It's the whole spiral. Like from his perspective, he was well intended, I think, but like it felt really gross. And then I told him, I was just like, oh my goodness, like I had no idea you felt that way. I was like, trust me, if you didn't want to talk to me, I wouldn't have been forcing myself upon you. Trust me. And then the head pastor basically told me, he's just like, oh, I think you knew. So then he was like calling me a liar and saying, no, I knew he didn't like me. And I was just like forcing myself upon him. And I was like, and so then, but then like, so I'm an interesting person because I have first percentile politeness if you're talking like psychological big five. And so I'm really low in or I'm really high in disagreeableness. I can be. And so, at that moment, I was like, not only was I hurt, but then I was just like, oh, now you're like assaulting my character. Now you're like calling me a liar about something you would have no idea. Like, how do you know what my intentions are? Like, that's a judgment of which you could never know. And so then I got really pissed. And and I and I basically said, and I basically just like called him out in front of the other two people that were there, the associate pastor and then my former friend. And I said, just wait a second. And I said, I want to go get my wife and I want her to come up here and I want you to say what you just said. Because at that point, I'm just like, this is bullshit. And this is all a horse and pony show. And I just want to start, and I want to start getting witnesses. Because, like, believe it or not, I actually believe the Bible. I actually believe Matthew 18. I think you should have somebody else come in. And then if you can't find agreement, then you should take it to the church. That's what the Bible says. But, like, this is the thing. They don't believe that shit. They don't want to take it to the church. They don't want this to become public. They want to control it. They want to keep it under wraps. And so then I brought up my wife, who and I feel bad for her, but she was the only option because she doesn't like this stuff. And then I had her come up and I'm like, say what you just said. And then he kind of like just completely changed his tone and didn't say it again. And I just looked, and at that point I was just like looking around. I looked at my former friend, I looked at the associate pastor, and I was basically just be like, are you guys seeing what I'm seeing? Are you cool with this? And they just sat there quietly. And at that point, I was just like, this is a joke. And I just said, I'm done. I'm done talking. I'm not going to do this anymore. Like, it doesn't matter. You guys
Wowzers.
don't care about the truth. So I'm done.
That's rough.
And it was really gross. And I don't know, and that kind of, I guess, so that story, and believe it or not, I ended up like apologizing to the pastor for how I handled it because I didn't think I handled it well. I don't know. It's so weird. Like church can be really culty in that regard. Um, and so all of that goes to show that like that, I think that thing was the beginning of me starting to see this systemic weird evil of institution that I like to talk about a lot now. I got into like the Tillich, all institutions are inherently demonic. And I don't know, it just started this thing where from that moment on, I was never comfortable really in evangelical church again. I kind of always, and I don't know, am I projecting it all the time? Was it always there? I actually went to a really, what I would say is a really healthy evangelical church. Like the pastor there isn't like a manipulative liar. And like this guy is not like evil. He's not the worst guy ever. He just whatever. He just is where he is. The pastor that did that to me.
Well, it's just weird because what he did is he basically was like, okay, this guy, like, and with a very fundamentalist mindset, it's like, oh, this guy is a heretic, and we need to
Right.
basically call him out, but we don't want to make a big scene about it. And like, I feel like they didn't even give you a chance. They didn't even hear you out, really. That's
Well,
unfortunate.
but like it's hard because I mean this had been going on. Like the context is like all these discussions have been going on for like over a year and a half. And I just slowly saw over time that like the whole idea of being Berean, like with the doctrine of hell, for example, do you really want to be Berean and search the scriptures and see what the Bible really teaches about hell? The truth is, and like granted, this was a church plant, so like they're just trying to stay alive. But like in reality, is like they don't really want to search that. You don't want to change your ideas about that. Like one of the tenets of your statement of faith is like an affirmation of eternal conscious torment. So like, are you really willing to semper reformanda rethink that? I don't think you are. I think you are, but I don't think you actually are. Um, so I started seeing that it wasn't just the problem of hell for me anymore. It was the problem of the inability to repent of wrong theological confessions. Like that thing, that kind of like institutionalized dogmatism is what started to really bother me. And then the short version is then like we moved back to Minneapolis. I went to another church and I just wasn't ever at peace there again. And
You
it
know,
got to the
I'm
point where
surprised
my
you even
wife
stayed with
was
the
like,
church.
well, this wasn't but here's the thing. Like I never understood, I never fell into the camp of like the ex-Christian, atheist, ex-evangelical, or like even going from like a conservative church to then swinging to a radically progressive evangelical church. I never really understood that because it's not like I never stopped believing what I believed. It was just like I don't think you guys believe it. Like I don't think the problem, it's kind of like how Michael Martin, this guy who goes with Grail Country all the time, he'll talk about like he's a biodynamic farmer. Are you familiar with him? And like is big into sophiology, and he's a poet and a musician. He's like this modern day polymath, and he's awesome. He's a brilliant guy. But he talks about like a lot of the COVID stuff. And he said it's just funny how like all the liberals and the progressives who used to be really cynical of big pharma and vaccinations, like if you used to go to the Pacific Northwest, they used to like those were all the unvaccinated people. And he's like, and then all of a sudden they did this hard switch to just like, oh, you don't love people if you don't get this vaccination, instead of being like critical of it. And he's like, what happened? Like, I'm the same. Like, I'm still the same guy who's been cynical of all this to begin with, but like, you guys all changed, you know? I felt like that with church. I'm just like, I'm not,
Hmm.
I still believe this stuff. And
Yeah.
I just want to talk about it.
Yeah. For me, like that was one of those eye-opening, I mean, the most eye-opening event was seeing how the church, how Christians, how specifically evangelicals reacted to the pandemic in 2020 and also reacted to that specific political year. They doubled, like in 2016, people hesitantly voted for Trump just because they were voting for the party. But then in 2020, people doubled down, and that was really eye-opening to me. And then, like, yeah, to seeing, yes, I understand that whole like aspect of the vaccine stuff. A lot of that stuff is like there's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of also fear mongering, virtue signaling there. But at the same time, it's just like it's just a general sentiment. That's what I think is almost more real than the actual implications is like the sentiment and the spirit behind certain people's beliefs. And like I feel like back in, like, for example, back in the day, if you talk to a Christian like 10, 15 years ago, they'd have no issue talking to you about the issues of racism in our country, or they'd have no issue. But now if you talk to a right-wing evangelical today, I don't want to say right-wing evangelical, just like a Christian today who's also involved in politics, they have such a hard time having that discussion because it almost has become like an attack on their very identity, and that's what's really fascinating, and that's kind of what
Yeah.
been eye-opening for me. That was a tipping point for me, like just seeing the fruit of people's lives, and it's kind of like what you're saying, like when you see what the underbelly of evangelicalism, then it's not pretty.
Yeah, I mean, it is and it isn't, because like we were saying, there's a lot of beauty there. Um, but it's complicated and they're very deep systemic issues, that like all that, the racism stuff, like that's what's currently going on. I don't know the status of it, but it's currently going on at Southern Baptist Convention, right? Is they're dealing with racism and social justice and
Well,
critical theory problems
you have
and
all these historically black churches that have no issue talking about racism because they have no other choice. They're very survival depends upon it, you know. And then you do have like this almost segregation that's happening within the Southern Baptist Convention, and a lot of
Mhm.
historical black churches are leaving the Southern Baptist, which
Yeah,
I think is fine.
it's such a weird phenomenon because I mean my parents go to a church that I think is in the Southern Baptist Convention, although they have a degree of autonomy, I think. And it's, I don't know, it's one of those places where I struggle in those kind of conservative Baptist Calvinist churches. And that's what I know. I think I would struggle in the progressive churches too, that are more social justice, because people become, I said this to Preston Sprinkle a long time, people become very dogmatic about things that they know little to nothing about. So like my parents' church, because I asked my mom about some of this stuff because I knew this was going on, or I'd heard that it was going on, this schism that's happening in the Southern Baptist Convention. And these people will talk about, and they'll do seminars on and lectures about, critical theory and what's wrong with it. And then I think like if I sat down with some of these people, and I'm not saying I'm an expert on it, but I think I understand and know what critical theory is a little bit and where it came from. And I'm just like, if I tried to sit down with you and have a conversation with your pastor, let's say on critical theory, I don't have a lot of confidence that he would even be able to tell me what it is. So like, I don't know how people can have really dogmatic positions about something they don't understand. And I actually think it's true on the other side too. I don't think a progressivist church that's really pro social justice could understand what critical theory is and what someone on the conservative side maybe is concerned with. And so then I'm like, so then what are we really fighting about? Like what's happening? Like what is that phenomenon? There was like a Tim Keller had a video. Also, actually, I'll post it in our Signal
Mm,
chat after this.
yeah,
But it was with Michael Horton and Matt Chandler. I don't know if you know who those guys are.
yeah.
Um, Probably like 10 plus years ago, but it was a gospel coalition video, I think. And the title of the video is like how to talk with those with whom we disagree, I think. And Tim Keller brilliantly in there illustrates this point where he says, when you're having a disagreement with something, you want to be able to state the person you're talking to's position so well that not only will they agree with you, but they would say like, oh, that's even better than I could say it. And until you get to that point, like you haven't even begun to understand their position. And to like the case that we're talking about, the example we're talking about, social justice and critical theory and conservatism and Trump and all that. Like I don't think either side has a clue what they're talking about, but they're very confident.
They're often talking past each other, and also
Yes.
like the straw man that's in our minds is the most extreme form of the other, you
Oh
know.
yeah.
And that's the whole issue, is like, are you battling the real thing, or are you talking about a straw man? And that's something that I've really been trying to test myself with. Is like, okay, I have a disagreement with someone. Am I disagreeing with? And that's actually gotten me in trouble, because then you assume what people believe, you assume what people are
Right.
thinking in their heads. But anyway, as we draw to a close, how did you get to orthodoxy? Let's get
Oh
there.
yeah. So yeah, that's the end. We've been circling in and out. So that's the end. So I went to this last evangelical church, probably, I don't know, and I don't know how long ago it was now, 7 years ago or something like that. I I just realized finally that I just couldn't do it anymore. And part of that is I would go to church and I'd be wanting to talk about these systemic issues that I was talking about. And I just couldn't get anybody else to see it. It's kind of like what you said. It was like speaking another language. And I was just upset all the time because like I really am kind of a zealot and I get so passionate about these things, especially when I was younger. I've learned to chill more as I've gotten older, but that I was just upset all the time where it was bleeding over into our family life, where I'm just upset and about everything because of my frustration with church stuff. And my wife was just like, we can't do this. Like, we have to figure this out. Like, we just need to go to a different church. We need to do something. And at that point, I had been exposed to enough Orthodox theology from the outside and just broad ways that the Orthodox think about things differently. And I had enough appreciation for their theology that I was like, well, I guess I'll just check it out. And it was so weird that like we just started, it was a cold, not cold, but I mean, it was just like a hard stop where um one night I remember Pete Enns was in town and I went out to a Pete Enns lecture, and it's on YouTube too. I'm like the last question in the Q&A of the night, but I was talking about him with all this because I didn't go to a small group. I went to this Pete Enns lecture, and I basically had this conversation with Pete Enns in the question form of like, I don't know. It's like I'm speaking a different language now, and I don't know what to do. And so then we just started attending the Orthodox Church, and I basically never looked back because I'm pretty open to things. So like the difference in the liturgy and the culture never really bothered me. It's just different. Um, and I love, I don't know, and I love everything about the theology. And it's hard, I mean, there's complications with there. This has been coming up in little corner conversations recently where I think there is a degree, or to your point, like your conversation with Brad Jerzak, there's a lot of converts to Orthodoxy that are just Eastern Rite evangelical. I think that's true. Like, what does it mean to be Orthodox in America? I don't know. Those are big questions that I
Yeah,
don't
that's a
have
good
the answer
question.
to. But that's how I got there.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So yeah, I can see how, like, theologically, as strict not strict, I don't want to say strict, but as like settled as a lot of doctrine is in Orthodoxy, there's also a lot of room for wiggle. There's a lot of wiggle room too, and
Dude, absolutely.
interpretation. And
One of my
also because
favorite,
they're not, yeah, because they're not so scholastic and propositional about it. Like, they don't have systematic theology, you know what I mean, where it's like, you
yeah,
must believe this. If you don't believe this, then or else.
yeah, no.
They approach things so mystically that it's like there's so much mystery involved, and in like, yeah. What were you saying?
Well, one of to illustrate your point, my priest said this brilliantly. This is a quote that I quote my priest on all the time. He was giving a sermon, and he said, people could look at Orthodoxy from the outside or just in general and look at all the structure and say like it's very conservative. And it is, like, it's hyper conservative. It's not changing. The liturgy, all that. The icons, the garments, all of that. And he says, but then you have to ask, and this is always the question with conservatism, is like, what are you conserving? And he says, in Orthodoxy, we're conserving hospitality. And
Wow,
I was
that's
just like,
beautiful.
damn, that's why I like
Conserving,
Orthodoxy
yeah, talk
right
about
there.
conserving the good things, conserving the
Yeah,
things that actually cost us. You know what I mean?
yeah, yeah,
A lot of times the things that we want to conserve and preserve are the things that allow us to remain in our power and privilege and authority. But
yeah. But
but
not none of the death.
none of the death. Imagine conserving laying down your life for another person. Imagine conserving, um, I mean, all throughout the New Testament, you have the scriptures about
Yeah.
this is pure religion. Taking care of
Yes.
the
Orphans and
widows
widows.
and orphans, widows, and remaining unstained from the world. Well, how do we remain unstained from the world? Well, the way the world works is transaction, right?
Yes,
Mhm.
100% mammon, and you can't serve
Yeah.
God and mammon. Maybe let's close on this. I've often thought this recently. What is the way to conserve hospitality in the modern world, in the world that we live in the Christian landscape that we live in America? Back to the spiral to bring it back.
Yeah.
Maybe it looks like dying to our self-righteousness about our self-identity to certain ideas,
Mhm. Wow. Yeah.
which I don't know that we're really very capable of because we equate that to holiness, and I don't
Mm.
think it is.
Yes. And to end on an even better note, toll houses. No, in all seriousness, yeah, that's a great point. We're conserving the good things: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. loving our neighbors as ourselves, praying and
Against such
blessing our
things there
praying
is
for.
no law.
Yeah, against such thing there is no law. That's one of that. I mean, obviously, I feel like that should be that should be our life, all of our life verses. There's a few life verses out there, but that's a
Yeah.
good one. That's a really
There's some
great
good ones in the old Bible. Note it, Jason.
Yeah,
Didn't know that one, did you, Jason? Bible
I'm
nerd.
sure he did. I'm sure he can tell us exactly what chapter and verse. What was it? Chapter 6 of Galatians, I think. I don't know.
Yeah, fruit of the spirit. Yeah, I think so.
Chapter 5 or chapter 6. I don't know.
I don't know. I've been Orthodox for 7 years. I don't care about the Bible anymore.
Yeah, you don't care about the Bible. They probably don't even have verses anymore. It's just you just read it. You read it off the scroll, right?
That's right.
In Greek, in Koine Greek.
That's right.
I don't know. Is your Orthodox? What expression is it? Is it an expression?
It's an OCA, so it's the Orthodox Church in America.
Okay, yeah, far out.
So it is the American, I guess what you'd call it. Like, I don't know that it's a.
Is it old calendar or new calendar?
New. I don't know that it's patriarchate, because that's what. Yeah, I have a buddy at a local buddy here who goes to a Russian church, and they're on a different calendar because often they're
far out. Wait, does that
things.
mean at a Greek because most Greek Orthodox churches are new calendar? Does that mean they have the same Easter as everybody else?
So I think it's this is a question. I don't know. I feel like, because I mean it's not necessarily a Western calendar, because that's a good question. I don't know. Because at my church, very often our Pascha doesn't match. I mean, what isn't the same as like Western Easter. So I guess that means they're like a different calendar, but I don't think that's the same. I don't know that that's like the Byzantine calendar. I don't know. I'm not a details
Julian,
person.
Gregorian, there's one that is objectively true and the other is going to hell. So
that's right.
We
know that.
On that note, thanks for joining me, Luke, and going down the spiral hole here on this Pi Day. Happy Pi Day, everybody. Get your pie.
Happy Pi Day.
3.14 blah 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 dot dot dot.
Yes. I think the dots are before, but yeah.
Yeah.
Or dot dot, like keep going. Yeah.
Come down that spiral with us, everybody. We invite you to go to the next level. Receive the hidden knowledge of the archons and the.
Another way to say that is like we encourage you to join us and die.
So each circle you die and go down, and the circle breaks. I think
most people would say in spiral dynamics up, but whatever. It's all relative. It's fine.
Oh, that makes more sense, right? Up towards God, because God is and then God at some point it's just.
But God is also down, man. Jung, like people don't see God because they don't look low enough.
He's at the bottom of society. He's in the poor.
In the cracks. That's how the light gets in, right?
Yep. Well, brother, have a great evening.
Yeah, same.
Day. You got snow out there?
Oh yeah, there's bunches.
Nice. Oh yeah, it's coming down hard in the east.
Yeah, it's not snowing here, thankfully, but yeah. Okay, peace.
See ya.